The story of the Mexican-American War begins long before the first shots were fired. In the year 1830, Mexico was still a young and fragile nation. It had only gained its independence from Spain in 1821, after a revolution that dragged on for more than a decade. What should have been the beginning of a new future turned out to be the start of years of disorder. Mexico emerged from that war in complete chaos with no clear system of government and no solid leadership to guide it. The revolutionaries who fought against Spain had no clear plan for ruling the vast territory they had inherited. Internal disputes quickly turned violent as different factions competed for power. Mexico at the time was a giant on the map. The country stretched across roughly 4.5 million square kilometers. It was one of the largest nations in the world, and certainly larger than the Mexico we recognize today. Yet the size of its land was no blessing. It had no money to organize or defend itself. The government was weak. The army was unstable. At the same time, rebellions within its borders threatened to tear it apart, while Spain still held ambitions of reclaiming it from its base in Cuba. In short, Mexico was in no condition to handle international conflict. And yet only 2 decades later it would find itself in a war with the United States. The United States in the early 19th century was on a very different path. It was expanding and gaining strength. After independence, it had moved further into Native American lands. The Louisiana Purchase from France had added a vast new territory. The national mood was hungry for more land and more opportunity. For Americans, the lands of the Southwest and California were tempting prizes. Mexico, however, was struggling to keep hold of its own northern frontier. Its central government was weak and distant. Settlers in regions like Texas became restless. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico after a bloody struggle that included famous battles like the Alamo and San Jacinto. Mexico never recognized that independence and still considered Texas to be its own territory. For nearly a decade, Texas stood as its own republic while the United States debated whether to bring it into the Union. Many in the North opposed it because Texas was a slave state and they did not want to tip the balance of power. Mexico, meanwhile, warned repeatedly that annexing Texas would mean war. Everything changed in 1844 when James K. Polk won the presidency on a platform of expansion. He wanted Texas. He wanted the Oregon Territory in the Northwest. He wanted California and New Mexico and all the land that stretched to the Pacific Ocean. His vision was the fulfillment of what Americans called manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the continent. Polk first tried to buy land from Mexico, but his offer was rejected. Instead, he ordered American troops into the disputed zone between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, which Mexico still claimed as part of its state of Coahuila. It was a deliberate provocation. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry clashed with American soldiers in that contested area, killing a dozen men. For Polk, it was the opportunity he needed. He told Congress that Mexico had invaded American soil and shed American blood. On May 13, 1846, Congress declared war. Mexico did not formally declare war, but the two nations were now locked in conflict. The circumstances of the outbreak were debated even then. Ulysses S. Grant, who would one day lead the Union in the Civil War, later admitted that the United States had deliberately provoked the fighting in order to justify an invasion. Mexico turned once again to a familiar figure, Antonio López de Santa Anna. He had played every side of Mexican politics, first opposing independence, then supporting it, then backing a monarchy, then a republic. He had risen and fallen, repeatedly serving as president in multiple terms. By 1846, he was in exile in Cuba, but he promised that if he were allowed to return, he would use his military experience to fight the Americans. What the Mexican government did not know was that Santa Anna had secretly been negotiating with U.S. representatives, offering to sell territory in exchange for power. When he returned, he betrayed both sides, declaring himself president and preparing to fight. The war quickly spread across the continent. In the north, General Zachary Taylor clashed with Mexican troops at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, winning both battles. American forces pushed into New Mexico. General Stephen Kearny marched into Santa Fe in August 1846 without firing a single shot. He established a temporary government under what became known as the Kearny Code. From there, his forces moved into California, where U.S. naval forces had already seized ports. Commodore John Sloat and later Robert Stockton occupied coastal cities, while John Fremont led a force of volunteers inland. Mexican resistance collapsed, and by 1847 California was declared free from Mexican control. The war in California was not without bloodshed. At the Battle of San Pascual in December 1846, Mexican lancers under Andrés Pico inflicted heavy losses on Cuny's army before being driven back. Yet by January 1847, American forces had defeated the last Mexican resistance in California at the Battle of Rio San Gabriel. Further east, Taylor pressed into northern Mexico. The Battle of Monterrey in September 1846 was bitterly fought with high casualties. Mexican troops fought fiercely from fortified positions inside the city, but eventually surrendered under terms that allowed them to retreat. In February 1847, Santa Anna marched north with 20,000 men to confront Taylor at Buena Vista. Taylor had fewer than 5,000, but they held strong in a mountain pass. After fierce fighting, Santa Anna withdrew to deal with political unrest in Mexico City. Though the battle was close, American propaganda declared it a victory, and Taylor's reputation as a national hero grew. While Taylor held the North, President Polk launched another campaign under General Winfield Scott. In March 1847, Scott carried out the first major amphibious landing in U.S. history at Veracruz. After a siege, the city surrendered. From there, Scott marched inland with 9,000 troops aiming straight for Mexico City. At Cerro Gordo in April, his army outflanked Santa Anna's defenses and forced another Mexican retreat. Step by step, the Americans advanced despite guerrilla attacks. By the summer of 1847, Scott's forces approached the Valley of Mexico. In a series of battles at Contreras, Churubusco, Molino del Rey, and finally Chapultepec, the Americans smashed through Mexico's defenses. In September, U.S. troops stormed the gates of Mexico City itself. Santa Anna's forces scattered. Scott entered the capital and took control, becoming military governor. For Mexico, the war was devastating. Its soldiers were often poorly trained, underfed, and badly equipped. Many deserted before battles began. They felt little loyalty to distant generals and more to their families and villages. For the United States, the victories created heroes like Taylor and Scott, who would later run for president. But even in victory, many Americans questioned the war. Some saw it as an unjust conquest meant to spread slavery. Abraham Lincoln, then a young congressman, openly opposed it. Grant later called it one of the most unjust wars ever fought. Now the United States faced a choice. It had conquered much of Mexico. Some politicians argued for annexing the entire country.